Can your employer make you work overtime? Look, overtime is a tricky issue. On one hand, it's often a good chance to make extra money, but on the other hand, it can be physically and mentally draining if it's all the time. So what if you simply just don't want to do it? Or worse, what if your employer is pushing you into it without giving you much of a real choice? Are you legally required to do it? Well, in just the next 7 minutes, I'm going to break down and simplify what the law is on overtime, what your rights are with regards to your working hours, and of course the best way to challenge your employer if they are acting unfairly. Of course, I understand we don't all want to appear confrontational with our employer, so this video will consider the best approach to avoid harmful confrontation. My name's Cal, your personal pocket-sized lawyer, and as always, we're turning complex legal issues into simple and easy to understand steps. So let's get started. All right, let's start with the basics. Can your employer ask you to work overtime? Now, the short answer is yes. Your employer can ask you to work overtime, but whether they can force you to do it depends on a few things. First, check your employment contract. If your contract says you are required to do overtime, then legally you might be obligated to work those extra hours when asked. However, there are limits to this. So your first step must, of course, be to read your employment contract. Now, if your contract clearly states that overtime is a part of your job or that reasonable overtime is expected, then you may have to do it. The key word here is reasonable. Employers can't demand that you work an excessive amount of extra hours, especially without notice. Now, if there's nothing in your contract about overtime, then you're not legally required to work beyond your regular hours, unless, of course, you agree to it. Number two, we're going to look at voluntary overtime versus compulsory overtime. Now, voluntary overtime, when your employer offers extra hours, you can choose to work them or not. You're not required to do this, and there should be no negative consequences if you say no. Then, of course, there is compulsory overtime. So when your contract specifies that you must do extra hours if asked, then you must do them. However, even then there are limits, which we'll go into in just a moment. Okay, so you've checked your contract and it says you might have to do some overtime. Now you're probably wondering, how much can they ask me to do? Well, this is where UK law helps protect workers, because under the Working Time Regulations 1998, there are legal limits on how much you can be asked to work, even with overtime included. Here is what the law says. You cannot be forced to work more than 48 hours per week on average, including overtime. Now, this is calculated over a 17-week period, so your hours may fluctuate week to week, but the average should not exceed 48 hours. Now, it's also crucial to remember that this same law also gives you rights to rest breaks and times off. So even if you're doing overtime, your employer is required under the Working Time Regulations to give you 11 hours of rest between work days. For example, if you finish work at 8 p.m, you shouldn't start again until 7 a.m. the next day. The law also says you're allowed 1 full day off per week or 2 consecutive days off per fortnight. Now, these breaks are crucial because you can't be expected to keep working without adequate rest. So if your employer is ignoring these rules, they could be breaking the law. Okay, so now let's assume you're not contractually obligated to work overtime, or you've done enough overtime according to the law and you don't want to do any more. Maybe you have family commitments, or you just need some personal time to recharge. So let's talk about your options and how you can best handle it. Number one, be honest with your employer. Communication is key. If you feel like you're being asked to do too much overtime, or it's impacting your work-life balance, it's worth having a conversation with your employer. Remember, your employers have a duty to maintain the health and mental well-being of their employees. And if they fail in that regard and allow you to be harmed mentally or physically by overworking, your employer may be liable for that harm. So let them know your concerns and, if possible, suggest alternatives. Remember to emphasize the word reasonable to your employer. And if you're being asked to work every weekend, or you're always doing late nights after your regular hours, that's probably unreasonable, and you can challenge this if you feel the demands are excessive. Now, this next point is extremely important, and this is regarding workplace pressure. Look, all this advice may all be well and good on paper, but I also understand the realities of workplace culture. You may be feeling pressured to say yes to extra hours to keep your employer happy. You want to fit into the culture of the workplace, and you don't want to damage your relationship with your employer, but you also shouldn't feel forced into it. So the best approach to take is to strike a balance. Make sure your employer knows you're committed to your job, but that you also have limits. It is okay to say no when it's getting too much. That leads us finally on to what can you do to challenge your employer if they are illegally forcing overtime. So quickly then, step one is to know your rights. As I explained before, read your contract first. Familiarize yourself with the sections on working time and overtime. Also familiarize yourself with the law that I previously mentioned, the Working Time Regulations 1998. Step two, keep a record of any and all instances where you've been pressured into working illegal overtime or denied breaks. This will help if you need to make a formal complaint later on. Step three should always be to speak to HR. So if you feel uncomfortable confronting your manager directly, try speaking to your HR department. They are there to ensure that the company is complying with employment laws. Step four is to raise a grievance or take legal action. So if you've tried to resolve the issue informally and it's still happening, you can raise a formal grievance. Now, if that doesn't work, you may need to seek legal advice. The Advisory Conciliation and Arbitration Service, ACAS, which you may or may not have heard of, offers free advice for dealing with any workplace disputes. And there you have it, folks. Look, overtime can be a tricky issue to navigate. But remember your key word when it comes to overtime, which is reasonable. It must be reasonable and cannot breach working time regulations. Just because it's the culture in your office, it doesn't mean you must go beyond your own limits. And that sums up the advice I can give you on this topic. So if you have liked or taken anything of value whatsoever from this video that I've made for you, maybe drop me a like and of course subscribe to the channel to ensure you have qualified legal advice in your back pocket at all times. Remember, although reliable, this advice does not qualify as legal advice. It is purely educational. And that said, I'll see you in the next video.